One.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Sharon Florentine. Welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar, Scaling Governance, Compliance, and Security Through Pipeline Automation, brought to you by Contrast Security. We have a really great webinar for you today, but before we get started, I need to go through some housekeeping items with you. First, please remember that this webinar is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of it, you'll be able to go back and watch it again. We'll be sending you an email with instructions for accessing the webinar on demand, or you can always visit us at Security Boulevard/webinars. It will be there for you as well. We are taking questions throughout the presentation, so you can use the Q&A tab on your console to submit those at any time. We will try to get to as many as possible at the end of the presentation. And stick around till the end because we're doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, and you will want to see if you are a winner. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Katie Corgett, who's moderating today's presentation. I'm going to turn my camera and my microphone off, and let's get right to it then. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Sharon, for the warm welcome and introduction for today's webinar. Contrast is super excited to be here with CloudBees today for a webinar on scaling governance, compliance, and security through pipeline automation. We're also very excited that everyone was able to join today. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here. We have a packed agenda for you for today's webinar. We're going to start off with introductions, and then we're going to go into objectives and why we're here today. Talk a little bit about the problem, what we're seeing in today's world. Then we'll go into the solution and some working examples, and we'll wrap up with Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and kick off the introductions. I'll start off by introducing myself. I'm Katie Corgett. I am the head field marketer here at Contrast Security. Super excited to be working with both Mark and Shozab to be here for this webinar. You'll see Shozab has a Showtime logo next to his name, and Mark let me in on a little secret that Showtime is his nickname, and I think that is a great transition. It's Showtime. We're starting this webinar, and I'm going to hand it over to Mark and let him introduce himself.
Thanks, Katie. So my name is Mark Tomza. I work on the alliances side here at Contrast Security, and I've been in the software space for over 10 years or so, which doesn't seem like a long time, but for our business right now in the current state of things, it kind of is. So my background primarily is helping companies with digital transformations, top down. I've been pretty much everywhere behind the scenes, building apps, software delivery, consulting, selling it. So pretty much everywhere under the sun. I've worked with Shozab in the past before at CloudBees and Electric Cloud. I've had the pleasure to do so. He's been an awesome guy, and he's been tolerating me ever since. So it's been pretty awesome. But yeah, I'll hand it off to Shozab. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I'm a solution architect at CloudBees, specializing in software delivery automation and helping enterprises with their digital transformation journey. Started my career developing and testing crypto cards and access controls on the mainframe, and then transitioning to distributed computing, building enterprise software to help IT organizations manage environments that span between on-prem and the cloud. Then I moved on to architecting solutions for continuous delivery. And, well, I guess similar to Mark, because of our history, I know throughout our career, we've been doing a lot of automation and orchestration throughout. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks both for being here today. Let's go into the objective and talk a little bit about why we're here and what we're going to talk about today. Mark, I'll let you go ahead and kick off this slide.
Sure. So we're going to be talking about incorporating security at the ground level of your digital transformation implementation via pipelines, right? Just because when you talk software lifecycle and automation from that perspective, you're pretty much talking pipelines within an org. So the whole thing here is to accelerate, scale, and ensure governance across the entire software lifecycle. Essentially, what you want to do is accelerate, scale, and then incorporate everything from the business side into your tech implementation. And the whole thing here is to essentially do it from the bottom up, so you're not having to go outside in. just as you know, I've been on both sides of the coin. So I've seen a lot of people try to backtrack. And the problem is when you start backtracking in terms of implementation, it becomes a lot harder. Shows up. Do you want to add a little bit?
No, you're right. Especially when you build out your processes and they're not scalable and they're not reusable, you're doing a lot of rework throughout your career, right? Different teams are reinventing the wheel when you don't have that templatization and reuse built into your overall process.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Now let's go into and talk a little bit about the problem, what we're seeing going on today, and kind of dive in from there.
As you all know, like with recent data breaches, like Equifax is kind of older now, at least. SolarWinds, the pipelines in terms of like the resourcing, the oil pipelines, ransomware, a whole bunch of different attacks. What's happening is hackers are actually able to go ahead and expose a lot of the vulnerabilities and exploits within current application stacks because the technology is moving so fast. A lot of the litigation that government's been passing in the past couple of months have been around basically try to combat that, right? So the president and his staff and pretty much everyone in that White House is essentially trying to help everybody out by giving them a way to kind of bring everyone up to speed in terms of the compliance and the framework necessary to actually ensure that your software is not just functioning, but functioning in a safe, secure way. And then it shows up. I want to kind of touch on what's been happening as of late because of COVID.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, with the lockdown and everything else, people are working from home or they're not working at all, and the need for automation and orchestration is in high demand, right? And because right now in the industry, especially when you're working with traditional enterprises, what we're seeing is they don't have that expertise. And how can they automate not just their current process, but also be able to pull in their security and compliance earlier in their software delivery lifecycle? Exactly.
And just to piggyback on that, it's faster than ever. Basically, in the past year, there's been more innovation in the software side than the past 10. So I just something to take into account when we're looking at like digital transformations and implementations overall, whether it be security and all the other value streams associated with software development. It's just interesting to kind of see how fast it's actually accelerating.
Exactly.
Awesome.
So the problem statement. So essentially this all boils down to security, compliance, and governance. And the thing that Shazab and I have both seen during the course of our careers is traditionally they've been afterthoughts, just because when you're talking innovation from the business side, you just want stuff delivered yesterday, right? So it was great when everything was wide open and everything was wild, wild west style in terms of implementation, but the world has evolved since then. And now all these different aspects of software delivery need to encompass security, compliance, and governance, just because you have things like breaches happening and other people who are able to actually go into different implementations. So like hackers, for example, they're very small units. When you're talking organizations like HSBC or financial institutions or any of like those old brick and mortar companies moving towards software development, those are very, very slow moving compared to like hacking organizations. And that being the case, you have to level everybody up. And the only way to do that is through automation, right? Things like low overhead and scale become center stage. And that's where the security and compliance and governance take place. And that's why we stress it. It needs to be embedded from the bottom up. And now it shows up and go a little bit of what we mean about needing to shift left.
Sure. I mean, if you think about it, traditionally the way security has been approached, it's not only has it been an afterthought, but it's never really been a high priority in the early stages of software development, right? Developers are typically focused on delivering software on time, and sometimes they have to cut corners, right? And typically what we see is, after a developer delivers their package to IT operations, then security kind of comes in there and plays a larger role. But during the application development process, it's really, like Mark was saying, it becomes an afterthought, right? When it's already in production and you're already, seeing vulnerabilities and hackers being able to leverage, really bad written code, that's when security comes in. And by that time, it's already late. You're losing a lot of money. right? And your brand recognition as well.
Exactly. The big thing here is how do you get it everywhere? Because we're not talking 1 or 2 implementations in-house. We're talking leveling up everything that you do that's making money for an organization.
Thanks, guys. Let's talk about the solution and how to solve this problem.
So how do we encompass security, compliance, and audit? Well, you have to take into account business processes, organizational aspects. Where are they in terms of culture? Are they doing things like DevOps, cloud native development? How far is their automation in terms of the software lifecycle? Are they automating any aspect of it? I mean, for work, Shozab and I for the past couple of years have been up-leveling companies in terms of the automation aspect of the implementation. And it's actually very surprising to see that a lot of companies are still trying to figure it out. And the reason for that is because a lot of people like to be creative and recreate the wheel. But if you look at software development in general, there are only really a handful of ways of getting this stuff out the door. And Shozab, can you touch upon the consumption and the scale of the business processes, just to kind of piggyback what I was saying?
Yeah. So if you think about it, right, what corporations really need to do, a large enterprise need to do, they need to, a lot of focus is focused on the technology, how to build a pipeline that are very tech specific. And what's not being focused on is how do I take that information and make it more generic? How do I incorporate business logic and business rules so I can build a software delivery pipeline that incorporates security and compliance and governance, and that is also reusable with whatever application that your organization is developing.
And what you see on the screen here is just a typical consumption model in terms of the automation process and business process encompassment. So if you take a look here, you have application team 1, 2, and 3. Optimally, they're cross-functional, but we've seen a lot of different organizations kind of go halfway in terms of having that cross-functional team status in there. And what we mean by cross-functional product-based teams is when you're delivering products, someone's usually in charge, like a product owner, an app owner, and they're driving basically all the enhancements and all the value streams, right? And you have a team together, and on the screen you could see QA team, dev team, and security team. Usually there's aspects of those teams allocated in a single application development team. And basically the story here is that you have all the different pieces you need to get software out the door without having to go to another department. That's what we mean by cross-functional product-based teams. So in terms of the security aspect, you want to embed security into those teams so you're not reaching out every 5 minutes to the security department on checks A, B, and C. And the way this works from an automation standpoint is if you take a look at the top on the platform team level, the platform team represents basically I call it the UPS of, how do you say this? Software development. So if you were to look at a assembly line, this would be kind of how the factory works with the assembly line. The platform teams work with those different integration points within the enterprise. So traditionally, these are different departments, right? So whether it's build, deploy, security, all those different responsibilities, it all boils down to the integration points, which can then be automated in terms of like APIs, right? So humans don't actually have to interact with most of this, and it's out of the gate templatized. And people take these templates in the form of automation, right? Like DSL, things like that, and then create workflows from it, aka pipelines, which are then distributed and consumed by application teams in the form of self-service. And Shozab, do you kind of want to touch upon your experience with this?
Yeah, I want to double click on your first statement about embedding security teams, right? What Mark is talking about is really making the individual from the security team part of the Scrum team, right? The Scrum team is typically developers who are building the software and also planning out how long it's going to take them to release something out into production or to a customer. By embedding the security teams now, when you're building your estimates or you're coming up with your estimates, you're also taking into account security and the security requirements and the compliance and the testing that's going to be needed to make sure that the quality and security of your code is also ensured. So then security doesn't no longer become like an afterthought at this point, right? Because now when you're coming up with your deadlines, you already have security baked into your process very early in the beginning, almost in the planning stage, if not the planning stage of your software.
Exactly, and I'll just kind of touch upon another aspect that I've actually seen a lot in terms of how people start implementing this. A lot of organizations make the mistake, whether it be at team level, department level, of trying to isolate and explicitly state security items instead of incorporating into the value stream. And what I mean by that is a dev should not care between a security enhancement and a enhancement that's a business level aspect. So essentially like a custom business definition. And what I mean by that is saying, look, you're going to find vulnerabilities in your software. A dev's job is to basically make enhancements via business logic. The security person's job is to coordinate with the app owner to actually prioritize and create work for a developer. That's how it works in terms of the value streams, right? That's how you actually get security at the ground level. It's not an afterthought if you're incorporating this as a value stream into your development cycle and bringing that to the consumer. On the business side of things, what we did here is we actually separated the business side and the tech side. So Shozab and I both know this is a huge no-no in terms of communication right now, just because the whole field has actually changed in the past 5 years drastically. It's been a lot longer than that, but especially in the last 5, cloud technology has enabled a lot of people within the business to get up to speed in terms of tech a lot faster. So when we say we separate the business side and the tech side, it's because in terms of like presenting the material, it's a lot easier to segregate it. But when you're implementing this, what you have to keep in mind is that the automation does the work and the business drives what the automation does. And shows up. Can you kind of double?
Sure, Mark. Think about the cost of finding a defect or a vulnerability or a bug or a security violation in production, right? It's not just the fact that you have to go in and fix the problem. It's your brand recognition, potential fines, right, that you may get from the government or whoever, right, and potential lawsuits as well. If you can shift left, not just security but everything, right, and discover these issues sooner, right, in development cycles, right, ensuring that you're doing and you're meeting your SLAs before you go into QA, right, then you're reducing the cost of, exponentially, you're reducing your cost of fixing those bugs, right?
Exactly. Yep. The thing to keep in mind is when you're in production, you almost never want to make a change. The only reason you make a change is if you either lose an IP or something else is drastically wrong. So whoever tells you, oh, just switch that off in prod, I'll double think that. And the technical implementation. So on the tech side, as I was saying before, let the automation do what it's made to do. One thing, automate. That's it. A lot of people like to recreate the wheel, like to do custom business logic and all this other stuff. If you look at the way software is built and delivered, there's only a handful of ways it's doing it. Yeah, there's new stuff coming up left and right with like Docker, containers, serverless. But if you really look at it, there's still build, there's still test, there's still security. And now if you're making money on it, there's compliance associated with it, right? So it shows that maybe you want to talk about a little bit about moving away from manual processes, just because I know from your experience with SDA, a lot of times when you step in for like POCs and stuff, proof of concepts, you're combating the fact that a lot of people want to actually put their hands on it before it goes into production.
Yeah, and there's, the first thing to do, right, is to start measuring your existing process, right? Is to figure out what are my bottlenecks, what are my potential issues in my existing process that I can optimize. And typically, what we're noticing is it's always the manual processing, right? It's a concept of, I have to open up a change request ticket. Okay, fine, open up that change request ticket, but that doesn't mean you can't automate that process, right? And when we start showing customers and our developers, look at this. I'm going to create a pipeline for you. It's going to do all these step 1, 2, and 3. It's going to integrate. It's going to run test cases, do X, Y, and Z, and it's going to compile that and push it into a change request ticket automatically. So you don't have to go into ServiceNow one by one, adjust and enter values. It's going to be done for you through the pipeline, through automation, and in fact, it may have more data than you would have done if you had done it manually.
Exactly.
And when they start seeing that, you start seeing something that took, like, I'll give you a perfect example. My build could be really fast. It could be like seconds long, right? My testing could be automated. It could be, minutes long. But if my change request ticket is taking me 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, that's a huge problem, right?
Exactly. And that's what we mean about basically like breaking down silos and then putting them back up, right? It's a saying in our industry where, okay, I'm doing DevOps, but then at the same time, people have a misconception that doing DevOps equates to speed. It doesn't. It's just about communication. Mm-hmm. That's the thing that kind of shows up touching upon, like, you have that communication, but in order to get actually super fast, you have to start automating that. And that's kind of where you get into like cloud native technologies and extremely distributed architectures. And the big thing here is to actually build confidence on the tech side and translate that into the business, right? Humans always associate familiarity and comfort with repetition. The more you do it, the more comfortable you're going to be actually doing it. And like Shozad was saying, you want to move away from manual processes, just because I tell us every single time I walk on site and a client, I tell them the first thing I say is code doesn't make mistakes. And they look at me cross-eyed because they don't realize, like, I'm talking about, look, humans are the ones that enter it in. Code does what humans tell it to do. So technically it's the human making the mistake, right? And I always tell people when actually like selling software, you're not selling software, you're selling insurance. Basically guaranteeing that what comes in comes out. And this all translates back into data-centric actions and accountability, right? To where when I'm going through and I'm making an action, it's based off certain criteria, right? And shows that maybe you want to talk about that aspect because that's actually super interesting.
Yeah. So I was going to show you this later, but when you start building, your software delivery pipeline, right? That's going to deliver code and push code out to developers or end users. I'm sorry, not developers, but end users and your production environments. You really want to make sure that, when your actual application or your artifacts are going between the different stages, between dev to QA to pre-prod to production, that they're meeting certain SLAs along the way, right? Is there code coverage? Yes, there is. Did I do a vulnerability scan? I did. Okay, great. Let's look at those results. Did they meet the requirements, right? Did you find anything that was, highly vulnerable and things like that, right? So you have these early on in your stages. So as your source code is moving through, or your artifacts are moving through the different environments, you're actually building a lot more quality code, and you're having a lot more confidence in what you're going to be delivering to the end user.
Yep, incremental versus large. That's a big key too.
Yeah.
So what we're going to touch upon are some basically real world working examples of incorporating security across the entire life cycle. So here, I'm just basically showing you a diagram of how the contrast security integration with Jenkins works. And Jenkins, as you all know, it's pretty much the de facto standard for DevOps continuous integration, or has been for the past, I think, maybe 20 years. It's been out forever. But it's an open source tool that's actually been used by everybody. And it's been basically the precedent in terms of automation, so much so that, like for me, for example, a lot of the times when I'm going through and I'm developing, I'm using Jenkins just to get up and running because it's it's free, but B, like working with Shozad and CloudBees, there's some stuff you can actually add on top for the enterprise, some niceties that actually make it a lot easier to use in terms of plugins and stuff. And the reason I'm showing this diagram is to kind of show you the integration points that Contrast has. So Contrast, the way it works is it uses declarative pipeline syntax to basically call a pipeline step. And so long story short, what it does is it creates pseudo gates within your process. So you can actually perform a scan on Contrast side, set a criteria to the scan. So as an example, if I have a criteria of anything that's a high or critical level value, nothing gets through to my next stage, right? So if I'm a dev and I go and I try to build something, it builds it and then runs like a unit test. And then that unit test, if I check a vulnerability and that vulnerability gets reported by Contrast, Contrast can then go and send a signal to the actual Jenkins instance, flag it, and then basically fail to build, aka the pipeline. And here are just a couple of screenshots are kind of small to see. But I touched upon the declarative DSL. The way it's configured is essentially you download the plugin, enter in all your details for Contrast, the connections. You put in the declarative DSL, right? So you have your template, and then you just factor in embedding the Contrast agent during deployment. So there's actual Contrast download step you can utilize. It's pretty easy. You literally just put in the location and it just downloads it for you. And then the next step, or the other step allocated with the plugin, is essentially called Contrast verification. And what it does, as mentioned before, it verifies the criteria against the vulnerabilities. So if I'm a dev going in and I click commit, right, it goes through, builds it, runs my tests, and if it fails the criteria, it never gets into the repository, right? It shows that maybe you want to talk a little bit about that as well. in terms of the process and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You've seen everything. You know what I mean?
Well, we can go to the next slide. I can kind of highlight this a little bit better. Yeah. So, as you progress through your software delivery lifecycle, right? Moving your applications, artifacts between environments, the gates that Mark was talking about ensure security and compliance through the entire software delivery lifecycle, right? This is where you integrate with tools like contract security, with static code analysis tools like SonarQube, and what other tool that you may be using, in order to even unit testing, right? So making sure that before I go into my QA environment, right, I want to make sure that my development teams have done at least 75% code coverage, right? So these gates are instrumental in building the guardrails, right, around security and compliance through your process.
Exactly. And the thing I want to, before, I don't want to cut you off, shows up, but one thing just kind of came to mind was when you're talking CI and release process, the reason why we separated it here was because when you're in a traditional enterprise, it's all segregated, meaning like usually you have like a build team, and that build team does the build. They hand the artifact off to the lower level environments, which would be your CD, and then finally into your release train, right? So it's like 3 different release processes incorporated. And Shazab and I have both been on proof of concepts and actually worked with a bunch of different clients where, they think this is okay. So we always talk about hindering the innovation in software development. The big thing here is, yes, we're presenting it in 2 different slides, the CI part and the CD part, but you want to get to the point where you're creating templates from this, right? So we showed you a diagram of the consumption on all this automation. So when you actually have the DevOps culture ingrained in the way you actually go and start developing code and enhancements with the business, you start to realize that all these processes can be templated. And when that's the case, why can't I put it in one pipeline? You know what I mean?
Right.
And the reason for that is because, like Shozad was saying, the audit, compliance, security aspects, it's all evidence. It's insurance that what comes in is what comes out. And Shozad, sorry to cut you off, but maybe you want to touch upon that too.
Yeah, man, that's a good segue, because by extracting your business logic, right, and your business rule, you can build a release pipeline, which then becomes that Uber orchestrator of your islands of automation that Mark was talking about in build and test and CD, right? And then you can start using the same release pipeline across your apps, across your teams. And when building a release, and let's say CloudBees SDA, you end up building a data-driven pipeline that not only ensures security, compliance, quality, but also collects all the evidence along the way, where then you can have your auditors come in and with the click of a button, have a full audit report of what happened, when did it happen, who approved things into what environments, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. And I tell people all the time, making software for money is different than making software. Because once you start incorporating revenue into that stream, everyone wants a piece, right? And because of that, you kind of have to have that compliance, audit, and security. That's why the White House, the government, everyone else is stressing, right? Like there's a bunch of innovation happening, but there needs to be control somewhat. Because if you look at what's happening in terms of like the software industry in general, it's evolving at a much rapid pace than people can actually kind of perceive. Like today versus a year ago, it's almost night and day. Like we work in an environment where now, if you're not using the cloud or consuming the cloud like 0%, you're not just behind. I would say you're out of business. Because the thing is, like, look at right now in general, we're all distributed. We're not in person. Those days, I don't want to say are gone, but this is a much different world we live in. Without the cloud, there is no work. And once people start realizing that, we use cloud in almost all aspects of our life today, right? Just to communicate, you start to realize like these silos that traditionally we're having to basically work across need to work together to create that value stream, right? And that's where the security, the compliance, and the audit step in with the automation, right? It's very interesting to kind of see how people are very, very easy to say, I want security in my pipeline, but you ask them how they do it and they kind of look at you with a blank face, right? You want it to be that invisible glue that's not really explicit, but it's there. The developer doesn't care about security. The developer cares about committing business value. It's the security person's job with the app owner to make sure that that stuff's funneled into his work stream. And that's what we mean by like feedback loops in terms of the automation, the business meeting one. Because a lot of people try to keep it separate, but it shows up and attest to this. Like CloudBees even, their whole message with SDA is software delivery. It doesn't like begin with the build and end with production. It's the entire thing across, including the requirements and how the business is actually driving the innovation and the consumers are feeding back into it. It's a huge picture. It's not just a little piece. And so once you step back and start recognizing that, you realize that this diagram actually makes sense.
Right. And if you go to the next slide, I can kind of show you what a release looks like, right? Here's an example of a release process that we've designed. And let's say a developer commits code, right? And that kicks off a CI build, right? A Jenkins build that goes through, build, and maybe does static code analysis, and maybe does a bunch of other things. And then it finally publishes something into a repository. The release kicks in saying, look, there's something new that's been published. Let me take a look at what was published, right? Because before I release it into QA or pre-prod or production, I want to make sure that this artifact that was just built, does it meet the requirements for a release candidate? So the first thing we do, we check to see is, okay, well, what was the code commit? Who are the developers that triggered this release or triggered this build? What were the JIRAs, the user stories assigned that are part of this, development, event? And then further on, we go say and make sure that, okay, well, we know you built it. One of the requirements of the exit criteria is security scanning. Well, did you scan your code with, a static code analysis tool or environment scanning solution like, or contract security, right? And before we look at the results, let's make sure that how those results were achieved, does that also match the requirements? Because I'll be honest, like developers, I was a developer. I try to cut corners all the time because my end goal was to get something out the door, right? So if I can circumvent security and trick Jenkins out a little bit, I'll maybe I did it, I don't know. But developers do. I mean, be real here. So like, we had a situation where we had a customer who had a requirement for running static code analysis, right? And every time the developers would run it, it would fail. And it was day before, deadline. And what they ended up doing was they went into the scanning solution and said, you know what, run the scan with no source code. And Jenkins was like, oh, everything looks good. It's green. And it went through. And then it went into production. And there was some issues there, right? But so what we ended up doing is just, instead of just looking just at the results, let's take a look at how that scan was done, right? Was it set to scan all the source code? And if it was, then we'll look at the results and before we pass you into QA, right? And this is what this pipeline is doing, right? It's checking to see if there's code coverage, is validating there was no critical violations, right, found by security scanning solutions. And then it will go into QA and it will continue on to the very end. Now, one thing I want to mention before we kind of go off the slide is we're talking about app security, but we also need to make sure that our pipeline itself, our software delivery, mechanism, right, that's pushing code out to end users is also secure, right? This is our supply chain, right? We've seen situations before where, people's software delivery pipelines have been compromised, where instead of pushing out updates to software, they were actually pushing out Trojans and viruses to the user, right? Again, especially if you're an antivirus, I'm not going to name the company, but if you're an antivirus company, you don't want to be pushing out, Trojans to your end users who are trying to update their virus definitions or something, right? What else, Mark?
No, well, it's kind of wrapping it up, but that's kind of where I want to touch upon was the automation is important, the business is important, but you have to have an idea of what you're actually trying to accomplish. When you're encompassing things like security, audit, and compliance, there's a reason for it, right? There's a reason for all these different things because they become part of the value stream that get carried down to the end consumer, right? The consumer doesn't want to use your app if it's insecure. And that's how contrast kind of fits in there, where at the application layer, a lot of the peripheries, right? Traditionally, networking and whatnot have been very peripheral in terms of security, right? So now we're actually looking at the app and people figure it out. I mean, you can ask hackers, you can have the best peripherals in the world in terms of security aspect, right? Like the clouds and notorious for this. They got policies everywhere, everything maps up, we're green to go. All of a sudden there's a hack. Well, why is there a hack? Well, because my app has a vulnerability on the SQL injection side. And people do kind of what it shows up just did and kind of like lean back in a chair and they realize that this could have been fixed beforehand. And that's what we mean by encompassing that in an embedded level, because if you're doing that at an embedded level, you would have caught that before production, right? So one thing I want to touch upon again is security is a must. It's not an afterthought, because if you're looking outside in, you start working outside in, you realize that it's a lot harder to retrofit automation than creating new stuff. And Shozop can attest to this.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I do want to mention is also, just because your code went through dev, QA, it's in production, it doesn't mean it doesn't have a vulnerability or an issue, right? Because it's possible that, no one's reported a vulnerability. So even when you're in production, continuously run scans, security, testing, verification. And when you do find something, right? Because let's say something got updated in the CVE somewhere, and now your software is picking it up. Your scanning solutions picking up a problem with your application that you deployed. Have a mechanism or workflow in place that says, well, when that happens, I want to do A, B, and C. I want to roll back my changes. I want to roll forward my changes. I want to shut down my environments that have this vulnerability in them, right? So make sure, just because it's out in production, the work is not done. Continuously.
Exactly. Yep, and just to double tap that. So basically, if you look at the production environment and you don't have the capability to change the automation, encompass something like runtime protection, which is also what Contrast does. So thank you for a plug on that, shows up. And then, and the one thing I'm going to stress again is the business and the tech, we segregate it in terms of explaining it, but the real life truth of the implementation and all those details is they're becoming one and the same. If you don't understand how the tech works, it's very hard to make business decisions today. And this is actually what we see day in, day out with customers all over the place. They try to talk the business lingo, but they're not understanding the technology. And so because of that, it becomes a big problem, especially now since everything is running on the cloud. Absolutely. And that's pretty much all I had, unless you have something else, shows up.
I'm good. Ready for Q&A.
Thanks, guys. Thanks so much for taking the time to be here. We're going to go ahead and hand it back over to Sharon, and she's going to kick off the Q&A. And everyone, please feel free to type your questions in the question box, and we'll do our best to answer this.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much. All right, folks. Yeah, go ahead. Send in your questions. We've got a bunch of time left. If you've got anything you're dying to ask, go ahead and send it over now, and we will take those now. All right. Let's see if, why don't we, while we wait, I will go ahead and draw our winners for the Amazon gift card drawing. And so let's see what we've got here today. Our first winner is Brian M. Congratulations, Brian. Our next winner is Jaya M. I hope I pronounced that correctly, but congratulations to you. Our third winner is Jack K. And our last winner is Alan D. Congratulations to all our Amazon winners. Folks, there is still time. If you've got questions, go ahead and send them in. Just a reminder, in the meantime, the session has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, you'll be able to go back and watch it again. We will send you an email with instructions for accessing the webinar on demand, or you can always visit us at securityboulevard.com/webinars. It will be there for you as well. And for our gift card winners, we will send you a separate email with instructions for claiming your gift card. So keep an eye on your inbox for that. And if you don't see it there, make sure and check your spam folders. All right, I guess that about does it for me as well, folks. Thank you all so much for joining today, and thanks for your time. We hope to see you again soon at another Security Boulevard webinar. I am Sharon Florentine, signing off.